Hello. We're resuming our book on animal magnetism by William Lang and the Reverend Chauncey Townshend from 1844. We just heard about how the medical profession was way too quick to throw out the solid evidence of animal magnetism or mesmerism. And now we're going to learn a little bit about how mesmerism works. We're picking up at Chapter 5. Mesmer was in the practice of seating his patients around a kind of covered vessel filled with water, iron, glass, etc., denominated the baquette. The magnetic virtue was supposed to be communicated to the patients by branches of iron from the baquette, by a cord which was passed around their bodies, and by the union of their fingers. The patients were, besides, magnetized directly by means of a finger or a bar of iron guided before the face, above or behind the head, and over the surface of the parts affected. They were also operated upon by touching, rubbing, and pressure with the hand. In this manner, what have been termed crises were brought on, which were supposed to operate beneficially in the ailments with which the patients were afflicted. The school of the Chevalier Barbarin admitted no other agents than faith and volition, and hence its followers obtained the designation of the spiritualists. A third school was established under the direction of the Marquis de Puysegur at Strasbourg under the name of the Société Harmonique des Amis Réunis. The Chambre du Christ, Mr. Colhoun informs us, were entirely banished from this excellent institution, and the whole magnetic treatment was conducted in a manner the best calculated to ensure the repose and comfort of the patients. The manipulations, when employed, were extremely gentle, and the hands, instead of being brought into contact with the patient, were frequently kept at some distance from him. Many of the writers on this subject insist strongly upon the necessity of mesmerizers possessing a strong constitution, and upon their being in sound health at the time of operating, as otherwise very injurious consequences may result to the patient. The processes in use among mesmerizers are exceedingly various. It is not in every case considered necessary to produce sleep, and the means employed are varied according to the effect sought to be obtained. The following methods are recommended by a writer in the Zoomagnetic Journal as the most simple and the most effectual. Let the operator take hold of the hands of the patient as if he were merely going to feel his pulses. At this stage he may look steadily in the patient's face and put any questions he pleases to him relative to his complaints, the seat of pain, etc. After a minute or two, let him place one hand on the crown of the patient's head and the other on his breast or stomach. Thereafter, let him place the palm of each hand upon the patient's shoulders, with the thumbs inclining into the armpits. And having continued for a few seconds in this position, let him then draw the palms of his hands, with the fingers pointing rather inwards, along the arms of the patient, gently downwards to the elbows, and from thence to the hands, which may be again held for a few seconds. The operator should then raise his hands upwards towards the head of the patient, the palms being carried outwards. Then, with the palms resting upon the sides of the patient's head, a few passes may be made with the thumbs from the inner angles of the eyes down the sides of the nose, and the hands should afterwards be drawn downwards from the shoulders along the whole body towards the feet of the patient. These passes may be repeated as often as the operator deems necessary. Afterwards, the operation of fanning, a term easily understood, may be employed, especially if it be thought requisite to produce sleep which has not followed upon the previous manipulations. We must not omit to observe, however, that the effects of animal magnetism have been frequently produced without employing any such manipulations as those we have described above, and that the mode of treatment must be regulated in all cases by the judgment of the operator, according to the degree of susceptibility manifested by the patient. The passes may be performed either with or without contact. In the former case, the contact in general ought to be very slight, but the operator must perform the whole business with earnestness and with a serious desire of removing the morbid symptoms. The apartment ought to be kept as quiet as possible so that neither the operator nor the patient may have his attention distracted during the treatment. Sleep is a very common effect of the magnetic manipulations, the first, indeed, by which the influence of the agent is made apparent to ordinary observers. Somnambulism is much more rare. The higher states, including the phenomena of clairvoyance or lucid vision, occur in comparatively few cases. It is a mistake, however, to imagine that the production of any of these states is absolutely and essentially necessary in every instance to the efficacy of animal magnetism as a remedial process. Hundreds of cases have been successfully treated without the production of sleep, thousands without the intervention of somnambulism. Deleuze, an eminent French mesmerizer, enters into very minute details on this subject in his Practical Instruction in Animal Magnetism. The following is an extract from his work. Cause your patient to sit down in the easiest position possible and place yourself before him on a seat a little more elevated, so that his knees may be between yours and your feet by the side of his. Demand of him, in the first place, that he give himself up entirely, that he think of nothing, that he do not trouble himself by examining the effects which he experiences, that he banishes all fear and indulge hope, and that he be not disquieted nor discouraged if the action of the magnetism produces in him temporary pains. After you have brought yourself to a state of self-collectedness, take the thumbs between your two fingers, so that the inside of your thumbs may touch the inside of his. Remain in this situation 5 minutes, or until you perceive there is an equal degree of heat between your thumbs and his. That being done, you will withdraw your hands, removing them to the right and left, and waving them so that the interior surface be turned outwards, and raise them to his head. Then place them upon his shoulders, leaving them there about a minute. You will then draw them along the arm to the extremity of the fingers, touching lightly. You will repeat this pass 5 or 6 times, always turning your hands and sweeping them off a little before reascending. You will then place your hands upon the head, hold them there a moment, and bring them down before the face, at the distance of 1 or 2 inches, as far as the pit of the stomach. There you will let them remain about 2 minutes, passing the thumb along the pit of the stomach, and the other fingers down the sides. Then descend slowly along the body as far as the knees, or farther, and if you can conveniently, as far as the ends of the feet. You may repeat the same processes during the greater part of the sitting. You may sometimes draw nearer to the patient, so as to place your hands behind his shoulders, descending slowly along the spine, thence to the hips, and along the thighs as far as the knees, or to the feet. After the first passes, you may dispense with putting your hands upon the head, and make the succeeding passes along the arms, beginning at the shoulder, or along the body commencing at the stomach. When you wish to put an end to the sitting, take care to draw towards the extremity of the hands, and towards the extremity of the feet, prolonging your passes transversely before the face, and also before the breast, at the distance of 3 or 4 inches. These passes are made by presenting the 2 hands together, and briskly drawing them from each other, as if to carry off the superabundance of fluid with which the patient may be charged. You see that it is essential to magnetize, always descending from the head to the extremities, and never mounting from the extremities to the head. It is on this account that we turn the hands obliquely when they are raised again from the feet to the head. The descending passes are magnetic, that is, they are accompanied with the intention of magnetizing. The ascending movements are not. Many magnetizers shake their fingers slightly after each pass. This method, which is never injurious, is, in certain cases, advantageous, and for this reason it is good to get the habit of doing it. Although you may have, at the close of the sitting, taken care to spread the fluid all over the surface of the body, it is proper in finishing to make several passes along the legs from the knees to the end of the feet. These passes free the head. To make them more conveniently, place yourself on your knees in front of the person whom you are magnetizing. I think it proper to distinguish the passes that are made without touching from those which are made with the touch, not only with the ends of the fingers, but with all the extent of the hand, employing at the same time a slight pressure. I give to these last the name of magnetic frictions. They are often made use of to act better upon the arms, the legs, and the back along the vertebral column. This manner of magnetizing by longitudinal passes, directing the fluid from the head to the extremities without fixing upon any part in preference to others, is called magnetizing by the long pass. Magnétiser à grande couronne. It is more or less proper in all cases, and it is requisite to employ it in the first sitting when there is no special reason for using any other. The fluid is thus distributed into all the organs, and it accumulates naturally in those which have need of it. Besides the passes made at a short distance, others are made just before finishing at the distance of 2 or 3 feet. They generally produce a calm, refreshing, and pleasurable sensation. There is one more process by which it is very advantageous to terminate the sitting. It consists in placing oneself by the side of the patient as he stands up, and at the distance of a foot, making with both hands, one before the body and the other behind, 7 or 8 passes, commencing above the head and descending to the floor, along which the hands are spread apart. This process frees the head, re-establishes the equilibrium, and imparts strength. Sometimes it is necessary to magnetize at the distance of several feet. Magnetism at a distance is more soothing, and some nervous persons cannot bear any other. In making the passes, it is unnecessary to employ any greater muscular force than what is required to lift the hand and prevent it from falling. The movements should be easy and not too rapid. A pass from the head to the feet may take about half a minute. The fingers ought to be a little separated from each other and slightly bent, so that the ends of the fingers be directed towards the person magnetized. Dr. Caldwell of Ohio, in his work entitled Facts in Mesmerism and Thoughts on its Causes and Uses, gives the following description of the mode of producing mesmeric sleep. Let the parties be seated close to each other, face to face, the mesmerizer occupying the higher seat, and the mesmerizee so accommodated as to sit at ease and in comfort, provision being made for the support of the head, in case sleep be induced. Having requested the mesmerizee to dismiss as far as practicable all agitating and impressive feelings, thoughts, and emotions, and be as tranquil as possible in mind as in body, the mesmerizer gently grasps his hands, applying palm to palm and thumb to thumb for the purpose of equalizing and identifying their temperature and condition. Continuing this for about a minute, the mesmerizer lets go his grasp, and removing his hands, and raising them just above the head of the mesmerizee, brings them gently down along each side of the head, very softly brushing it, and places them on his shoulders. Let the hands rest here about another minute, the mesmerizer all this time looking steadily and intensely in his subject's face, and forcibly willing that he shall fall asleep. The hands are then to be moved from the shoulders along the arms with a very light pressure, until they reach the hands of the mesmerizee, which are to be again grasped for 4 or 5 seconds as before. After a few repetitions of these movements, the operator may begin his more regular passes. These he makes by raising his hands near to the face or top of the head of his subject, and bringing them down with a gentle sweep along the neck and breast, touching these parts not being necessary, to the ends of the subject's fingers, turning his palms outwards and widening the distance of his hands from each other as they descend. The ends of the operator's fingers may also be advantageously applied at times to the pit of the patient's stomach and held there for a short time. In making their passes, some operators draw their hands not only along the whole extent of the upper extremities of the patient, but also down the lower extremities to the knees. This, however, I have not found necessary, perhaps not even useful, having been able to effect my purpose without it. The passes may be continued from 12 or 15 to 30 minutes, according to circumstances, and during the subsequent experiments, while the patient is asleep, they may be occasionally renewed to hold the sleep sufficiently profound. Such is the usual form of the mesmeric process, the operator continuing to will during the whole time of it, the production of the phenomena at which he aims. Under the hands of some mesmerizers, the process is much simpler, the foregoing being of a formal and rather complex kind. The Reverend Mr. Townshend gives no formal directions for producing the mesmeric sleep, but we should infer that the method he employs is much less complicated than some others. In the appendix to Facts in Mesmerism, the celebrated Professor Agassiz gives a description of the sensations which he felt on being mesmerized, and we gather from it the mode of proceeding adopted by Mr. Townshend. Professor Agassiz says, "About 10, Mr. Townshend commenced operating on me. While we sat opposite to one another, he, in the first place, only took hold of my hands and looked at me fixedly. I was firmly resolved to arrive at a knowledge of the truth, whatever it might be, and therefore, the moment I saw him endeavoring to exert an action upon me, I silently addressed the Author of all things, beseeching him to give me power to resist the influence, and to be conscientious in regard to myself as well as in regard to the facts. After at least a quarter of an hour, I felt a sensation of current through all my limbs, and from that moment my eyelids grew heavy. I then saw Mr. Townshend extend his hands before my eyes as if he were about to plunge his fingers into them, and then make different circular movements around my eyes, which caused my eyelids to become still heavier. I had the idea that he was endeavoring to make me close my eyes, and yet it was not as if someone had threatened my eyes, and in the waking state I had closed them to prevent him. It was an irresistible heaviness of the lids which compelled me to shut them, and by degrees I found that I had no longer the power of keeping them open, but did not the less retain my consciousness of what was going on around me. So that I heard Monsieur Desor speak to Mr. Townshend, understood what they said, and heard what questions they asked me, just as if I had been awake, but I had not the power of answering. Mr. Townshend then repeated some frictions which increased my sleep, yet I was always conscious of what was passing around me. He then asked me if I wished to become lucid, at the same time continuing, as I felt, the frictions from the face to the arms. I then experienced an indescribable sensation of delight, and for an instant saw before me rays of dazzling light, which instantly disappeared. Mr. Townshend then woke me with some rapid transverse movements from the middle of the face outwards, which instantly caused my eyes to open, and at the same time I got up, saying to him, "I thank you." It was 11:15. He then told me, and Monsieur Desor repeated the same thing, that the only fact which had satisfied them that I was in a state of mesmeric sleep was the facility with which my head followed all the movements of his hand, although he did not touch me, and the pleasure which I appeared to feel at the moment when, after several repetitions of friction, he thus moved my head at pleasure in all directions. The above description is doubly interesting, as coming from one who occupies so high a position in the scientific world as Monsieur Agassiz. A method of mesmerizing a number of individuals at the same time is thus described by Mr. Townshend. "I have sometimes formed what may be called a mesmeric pile, by seating 5 or 6 persons together in a line, or half-circle, holding each other's hands. I then mesmerized the first in the rank, who has passed on the influence to the second, who has again transmitted it to the third, and so on, by each pressing the hand held by each at regular periods of time. Under this treatment I have invariably found that the mesmeric influence was most powerfully demonstrated in the person who was farthest from myself, that is, in the person who received the original impulse through the greatest number of intervening transmitters. The shades of gradation were also in these experiments justly preserved, the first person scarcely experiencing any sensation, the second feeling a more decided influence, and so on in progression, till the last was thrown into the complete mesmeric state. Sir G. S. Mackenzie has published in the Phrenological Journal an account of the method of mesmerizing practiced by Mr. Gardiner of Roche Court, who, Sir George states, was the first to observe the extraordinary effects of exciting the organs of the mental faculties of patients in the magnetic trance. The directions given to mesmerizers by Mr. Gardiner are the following. Dismiss all preconceptions from your mind. Check the tendency we all of us have to prejudge and pre-theorize. Banish all hypothesis, and advance to your subject as an experimentalist. Say nothing to anybody. Select for your trial a person of rather a sedate character and not too young. Shut yourself and the patient into a quiet room with no spectators, and let him or her sit in an easy posture with support for the head. Dismiss from your thoughts all idea of the necessity of mode or fashion or particular passes. Concentrate your faculties, and be not distracted by anything. Let your volition be earnest, and first try the power of your eye, aided, if you like, by taking the hand. Let the patient look at you, and do you regard him or her visually and mentally with a fixed and determined and definite purpose, and it is more than probable that, ere the lapse of many minutes, you will feel and see the establishment of your power. If not, try the points of your fingers directed to the eyes, putting them as close as possible without touching the lashes or the hair. Should no effect ensue in half an hour, I would advise you to desist and try another patient. If effects be produced within that time, go on until you see that they do not increase, and then demagnetize by transverse passes, and blowing on the face and head upwards from the neck, or other means, and try the same patient again the succeeding day, and go on till you produce all the higher phenomena. This is what I recommend, for no magnetizer ought to dogmatize. No two cases are alike, and some patients are readily affected by one process and not by another, while some will yield almost instantaneously to a certain magnetizer, who have withstood the efforts of many others, although the same process be used by them all. If you wish specially to entrance or influence a particular person, place him or her at the extremity of a chain of persons holding each other by the hand, and do you proceed to magnetize the person at the other extremity of the chain. Tough must that person be who can withstand this. The greater the number of persons forming the chain, the better. Dr. Elliotson's method of producing the mesmeric sleep is exceedingly simple, being usually accomplished by simply pointing two fingers to the eyes of the patient. He is opposed to the opinion that the will of the operator has any effect in putting the patient to sleep. In a recent communication with which we were favored, in reply to questions regarding the probability of injury to the health of a patient from being too frequently mesmerized, Dr. Elliotson says, "When mere deep sleep is produced, I have never seen harm from the most frequent mesmerizing, but when there is any activity in the sleep, the process may easily be repeated often enough to cause mischievous excitement. Flushing, headache, giddiness, and even a little delirium may result. Whenever any of these threaten, the process should be slackened, whatever the benefit that has resulted." It is unnecessary to enter into farther details regarding the various processes adopted by different mesmerizers. Those which have simplicity and an absence of mystery to recommend them will, we are certain, meet with the highest degree of approval. It has been a common error to suppose that mesmerism is only operative upon those who are feeble in body. Let us listen to what Mr. Townshend says on this point. Mesmerism is one of nature's great resources in the cure of maladies, and it is not therefore wonderful if some of its most striking effects should have been developed rather in the ailing and the delicate than in the healthy and robust. Hence the world, always ready to build up error on truth, has connected it in idea with weakness of mind, as well as of body, and has classed it amongst those idle imaginings which beset the fanciful invalid. But what is the fact? Mesmerism does indeed act more peculiarly on the nervous system, and on that account affects in an especial manner persons whose nervous system is finely organized. But we must not confound sensitiveness with imbecility. The universal temperament of genius gives the lie to such an error, and it would be plainly ridiculous to say that the timid and susceptible author of an elegy in a country churchyard, or Rousseau or Pascal, who were both nervous, even to hypochondriacism, were weak in intellect because they were strong in sensibility. Besides, before we identify mesmerism with weakness of any kind, it should be shown that none but the feeble are susceptible of its influence. Now, as far as my experience goes, I can affirm that not only does a certain degree of intelligence appear requisite for the favorable manifestation of the mesmeric phenomena, but that persons in perfect health have frequently exhibited them. It may also be asserted that fear and nervous agitation are wholly incompatible with their genuine development. These may indeed accompany a spurious sort of mesmeric affection, but are wholly distinct from the powers with which they coexist, and to which they are invariably hurtful. They are the corruptions of the true faith, and not the faith itself. In fine, sensibility, and not weakness, is the real condition on which mesmerism depends. In the space of less than 2 years, Mr. Townshend succeeded in inducing the mesmeric sleep in 23 individuals, and in 8 instances he failed. Of the 23, 6 only were women, and 1 only a decided invalid. They were, moreover, not cases selected by Mr. Townshend as likely subjects for mesmerism, but came to him accidentally. Dr. Caldwell gives it as his opinion that a large majority of mankind are susceptible of the mesmeric influence, the proportion, so far as his experience goes, being similar to that of Mr. Townshend. One able mesmerizer had assured him that he had succeeded in 14 out of 15 trials. Mr. Braid states that at one of his public lectures in Manchester, 14 male adults in good health, all strangers to him, stood up at once, and 10 of them were successfully operated upon. At Rochdale he succeeded with 20 strangers in one night. At a private conversation to the medical profession in London, on the 1st of March, 1842, 18 adults, most of them strangers to him, sat down at once, and in 10 minutes 16 of them were decidedly hypnotized. On another occasion, Mr. Braid took 32 children into a room, none of whom had either seen or heard of hypnotism or mesmerism. In 10 or 12 minutes the whole 32 were hypnotized, and maintained their arms extended. These facts are sufficient to show that a large majority of the human race are susceptible of this influence, whatever its nature may be, and if, as we have reason to believe, human suffering may, through its instrumentality, be materially alleviated, we have abundant reason to thank the men who, defying persecution, have stood nobly forward in support of the truth. We would, at the same time, join with preceding writers in deprecating the practice of mesmerism by the ignorant or the unwary. But for the supercilious and unpardonable neglect of the medical faculty, its administration would long ago have been entrusted entirely to their hands, as an important branch of the healing art, and they will yet be compelled to adopt that at which the vast majority of them have hitherto sneered. The people have already obtained more knowledge on the subject than is possessed by the members of a profession which is by courtesy denominated learned, and popular mesmerism or hypnotism, or whatever other name may ultimately be adopted, names being an affair of comparatively little consequence, will ere long put the wisdom of the medical faculty to the blush. That's the end of that chapter. Here's chapter 6. As regards the higher order of phenomena which have been witnessed during magnetic somnambulism, there is great analogy between them and what takes place in ordinary somnambulism, though the former necessarily excite a greater degree of wonder from being performed at the mental instigation of the magnetizer. In natural as in artificial somnambulism, the individuals, when awakened, have no recollection of what takes place while they were in this state, but not unfrequently, when again in somnambulism, remember what took place in the preceding attack. They likewise, when walking, avoid the objects in their way, even in darkness, or when the eyes are closed. And in those cases where the eyes are open, vision is most probably not performed by them, the stare being fixed and vacant. And there's a footnote here. Shakespeare alludes to this state in Lady Macbeth. Gentlewoman, her eyes, you see, are open. Doctor, Aye, but their sense is shut. There is no doubt, says Dr. Millingen, but that in somnambulists the intellectual functions are not only active, but frequently more developed than when the individual is awake. Persons in this state have been known to write and correct verses and solve difficult problems, which they could not have done at other times. In these actions and locomotions they are more cautious and frequently more dexterous than when awake. A similar phenomenon, in some cases of this affection, is that of walking about without groping whether the eyes are closed or open. Dr. Dyce, of Aberdeen, describes the case of a girl in which this affection began with fits of somnolency, which came upon her suddenly during the day, and from which she could at first be roused by shaking or by being suddenly taken out into the open air. During these attacks, she was in the habit of talking of things that seemed to pass before her like a dream, and was not at the time sensible of anything that was said to her. On one occasion, she repeated the entire baptismal service of the Church of England, and concluded with an extemporary prayer. In her subsequent paroxysms, she began to understand what was said to her, and to answer with a considerable degree of consistency, though these replies were in a certain measure influenced by her hallucination. She also became capable of following her usual employment during the paroxysm. At one time she would lay out the table for breakfast, and repeatedly dress herself and the children, her eyes remaining shut the whole time. The remarkable circumstance was now discovered that during the paroxysm she had a distinct recollection of what had taken place in former attacks, though she had not the slightest recollection of it during the intervals. She was taken to church during the paroxysm, and attended the service with apparent devotion, and at one time was so affected by the sermon that she actually shed tears. Yet in the interval she had no recollection whatever of the circumstance, but in the following paroxysm she gave a most distinct account of it, and actually repeated the passage of the sermon that had so much affected her. This sort of somnambulism, relating distinctly to two periods, has been called, perhaps erroneously, a state of double consciousness. During the attack, her eyelids were generally half shut, and frequently resembled those of a person laboring under amaurosis, the pupil dilated and insensible. At one time, Dr. Dyce affirms, she read distinctly a portion of a book presented to her. The following is given by Mr. Colhoun on the authority of the Aulic Counselor and Professor Feder of Göttingen. A student, during a severe nervous complaint, experienced several attacks of somnambulism. Upon these occasions he would go from his bedroom to his parlor and back, open and shut the doors, and take out of the closets what he wanted, pieces of music, pen, ink, paper, etc., and all this with his eyes shut. From among his music he picked out a march from the Medea, laid the sheet in a proper situation before him, and having found the appropriate key, he played the whole piece with his usual skill upon the harpsichord. In the same manner he also played one of Bach's sonatas, and gave the most expressive passages with surprising effect. One of the persons present turned the notes upside down. This he immediately perceived, and when he again began to play, he replaced the sheet in its proper situation. While playing, he remarked a string out of tune, upon which he stopped, put it in order, and then proceeded. He wrote a letter to his brother, and what he wrote was not only perfectly rational, but straight and legible. While Professor Feder was on a visit to him one afternoon, he observed that it was snowing, which was really the case. On the same day he remarked, notwithstanding his eyes were closed, that the landlord of the opposite house was standing at the window, which was true, and the hats were hanging in the window of another room of the same house, which was also correct. Another case from the Transactions of the Medical Society of Breslau is cited in the same work. A rope maker, aged 23 years, was frequently overtaken by sleep even by daylight and in the midst of his usual occupations, whether sitting, standing, or walking. His eyes were firmly closed, and he lost the use of his external senses. While in this state, he sometimes recommenced doing all that he had been engaged in during the previous part of the day, from his morning devotions up to the commencement of the paroxysm. At other times, he would continue the work in which he happened to be engaged at the time, and finished his business with as great care and success as when awake. When the fit overtook him in traveling, he did not stand still, but proceeded on his journey with the same facility and almost faster than when awake, without missing the road or stumbling over anything. In this manner, he repeatedly went from Naumburg to Weimar. Upon one of these occasions, he came into a narrow lane across which there lay some timber. He passed over it regularly, as if awake, without injury. With equal care and dexterity he avoided the horses and carriages which came in his way. At another time he was overtaken by sleep a short while before setting out for Weimar on horseback. He rode through the river Ilma, allowed his horse to drink, and drew up his legs to prevent them from getting wet. He then passed through several streets, crossed the marketplace, which was then full of people, booths, and carts, and arrived in safety at the house where his business lay. During the continuance of the paroxysm he was quite insensible. Though pricked, pinched, or struck, he felt nothing. He could not see when his eyes were forced open. He could not smell even the most volatile spirit, nor could he hear the report of a pistol when fired close beside him. Here, then, is no foundation for the hypothesis of one sense supplying the place of another, because all the external senses were ascertained to be completely dormant. The case, it is conceived, can only be accounted for by assuming, as warranted by the facts, a transference of the faculties, and that the internal sense, the soul, manifested its energies through other than the usual organs. A case is related by Ritter in Moritz's Psychological Magazine of a boy 10 years of age who became subject to fits of drowsiness and frequently fell asleep suddenly even in the daytime, whether sitting or standing. In this state he would converse with persons present, and although his eyes were to all appearance completely closed, he was able to see and discriminate all objects presented to him. When awakened, he recollected nothing of what had occurred during his sleep, but would talk of other matters. On his again falling asleep, the thread of discourse could be taken up where it had been previously interrupted and continued. When he again awoke, he remembered nothing of the conversation that had occurred during his sleep, but recollected what had been last said to him when awake, and thus, says the reporter, it appears as if he had two souls, one for the state of sleep and the other for the period when he was awake. A somewhat similar case is given in the Medical Repository of America for January 1816. The patient was an accomplished young lady who, in a state of somnambulism, lost all recollection of her previous acquirements, and like a child was obliged to commence her education anew. When restored to her natural state, she again became possessed of her former knowledge, but remembered nothing of what occurred in the interval. During 4 years, these two states alternated periodically, but she herself possessed as little consciousness of her double character as two distinct persons of each other. The case of Jane C. Ryder, of Springfield, Massachusetts, a natural somnambulist, is so well attested that it seems impossible to reject the proofs by which it is substantiated. She was the daughter of a respectable mechanic, and in her 17th year. This girl would rise in her sleep while her eyes were tightly closed, and go through a variety of duties, to the performance of which the sense of vision has been deemed indispensable. She would thread a needle and sew in a room, from which the light was utterly excluded. She would recollect, during a paroxysm, circumstances which occurred in a former attack, though there was no remembrance of them in the interval. Attempts to rouse her from her somnambulic state were uniformly unsuccessful. She heard, felt, and saw, but the impressions which she received through her external senses had no tendency to wake her. Though no decisive experiments were at first made to establish the fact, the members of the family in which she lived were very early convinced that she saw both when her eyes were closed and in the dark. They were irresistibly led to this conclusion when they saw her, night after night, perform that which seemed impossible to do without the aid of vision, when at the same time they could discover nothing that indicated the want of sight. She never betrayed anything like hesitancy or indecision. There was no groping, no feeling after the object which she wished to lay hold of. but the motion was quick and direct, as if perfectly aware of its precise situation. When obstacles were placed in her way, or the position of a thing was changed, she always observed it and accommodated herself to the change. This kind of evidence, though perfectly satisfactory to eyewitnesses, is not so well calculated to produce conviction in the minds of others as tests of a different kind. No direct trial of her powers of vision was made until Sabbath evening, November 10th, 1833, when it was proposed to ascertain whether she could read with her eyes closed. She was seated in a corner of the room. The lights were placed at a distance from her, and she was so screened as to leave her in almost entire darkness. In this situation she read with ease a great number of cards which were presented to her, some of which were written with a pencil, and so obscurely that in a faint light no trace could be discerned by common eyes. She told the date of coins, even when the figures were nearly obliterated. A visitor handed her a letter with the request that she would read the motto on the seal, which she readily did, although several persons present had been unable to decipher it with the aid of a lamp. The whole of this time the eyes were, to all appearance, perfectly closed. On Wednesday, November 20th, says Dr. Belden, her medical adviser, to whose interesting volume we are indebted for these facts, I took a large black silk handkerchief, placed between the folds 2 pieces of cotton batting, and applied it in such a way that the cotton came directly over the eyes and completely filled the cavity of the nose. The silk was distinctly seen to be in close contact with the skin. Various names were then written on cards, both of persons with whom she was acquainted and of those who were unknown to her, which she read as soon as they were presented. In reading, she always held the paper the right side up and brought it into the line of vision. Being desirous to prove, if possible, that the eye was actually closed, I took 2 large wads of cotton and placed them directly on the closed eyelid, and then bound them on with the handkerchief before used. The cotton filled the cavity under the eyebrow, came down to the middle of the cheek, and was in close contact with the nose. The former experiments were then repeated without any difference in the result. December 13th. Jane had a more interesting paroxysm than at any time before since her residence in the hospital. In a paroxysm the day previous, she lost a book, which she could not afterwards find. Immediately on the access of the paroxysm today, she went to the sofa, raised the cushion, took up the book, and commenced reading. She read 2 or 3 pages to herself. Her eyes were then covered with a white handkerchief folded so as to make 8 or 10 thicknesses, and the spaces below the bandage filled with black velvet. She then took a book and read audibly, distinctly, and correctly nearly a page. It was then proposed to her to play backgammon. She said she knew nothing of the game, but consented to learn it. She commenced playing with the assistance of one acquainted with the moves, and acquired a knowledge of the game very rapidly. She handled the men and dice with facility, and counted off the points correctly. Had another paroxysm in the afternoon, in which she played a number of games of backgammon, and made such proficiency that, without any assistance, she won the 6th game of Dr. Butler, who is an experienced player. Knowing her to be a novice, he suggested several alterations in her moves. These alterations she declined making, and the result showed the correctness of her judgment. The doctor, a little mortified at being beaten by a sleeping girl, tried another game in which he exerted all his skill. At its close, she had but 3 men left on the board, and these so situated that a single move would have cleared the whole. While she was engaged in this game, an apple was taken from a dish in which there were several varieties, and held before her, but higher than her eyes. On being asked its color, she raised her head, like a person who wished to see an object a little elevated, and gave a correct answer to the question. In the lucid interval, half an hour after she awoke from the paroxysm, it was proposed to her to play backgammon. She observed she never saw it played, and was wholly ignorant of the game. On trial it was found she could not even set the men. Many more extraordinary facts are presented by Dr. Belden. In the appendix to his work, among several letters, wherein the writers bear testimony to the truth of his statements, we find the following. The first is from the Honorable William B. Calhoun, for several years Speaker of the Massachusetts House of Representatives, and afterwards a member of Congress from that state. The second is from the Reverend W. B. O. Peabody, well known to the literary world for his tasteful and elegant writings. Dear Sir, in reply to your note of the 30th ultimo, I can simply state that I saw Miss Ryder repeatedly in the paroxysms of somnambulism or reverie. Her eyes were covered with a closely folded silk handkerchief, having a thick wadding of cotton underneath, the whole drawn tightly under her eyes. In this situation, I saw and heard her read whatever was presented to her, promptly and distinctly, under circumstances which precluded, in my opinion, all chances of deception. Several experiments of this nature were tried in my presence, which satisfactorily removed all the distrustfulness that I had previously felt. Your friend and obedient servant, W. B. Calhoun. Boston, February 6, 1834. Dear Sir, I had the pleasure of hearing your lecture delivered in the Springfield Lyceum, and with respect to those facts which fell under my observation, I can confidently add my testimony to your own. Before I saw Jane Ryder, I had no confidence whatever in the reports which I heard of her extraordinary power of vision, for the simple reason that I thought it more easily accounted for on the supposition of imposture. Acting under this impression, when I first saw her in this state, I endeavored to startle her with a charge of imposture, so sudden and unexpected that she must have betrayed signs of some emotion, of anger at least, had she been conscious of what was passing. But such experiments, though convincing, were unnecessary, for the most skeptical could not see her for any length of time without being persuaded that she was actually in a deep sleep. I saw your experiments in which you covered her eyes, and after close examination I was convinced that she could not see under the bandage, but had she done so, the papers which she read were held in such a manner as not to be seen in that direction. While one of the cards was before her, I looked at it at the same time and to the same distance without being able to distinguish a letter, which was the more remarkable since I ascertained by experiment when she was awake that she was very nearsighted, not being able to read at the distance of 2 feet what others could read without difficulty when it was twice as far from their eyes. When these experiments and the precise circumstances under which they were tried are given to the world in your lecture, those, if there are any who are not inclined to admit the facts, will be under the necessity of showing in what manner you were deceived. Your experiments were as numerous and thorough as circumstances would allow, so that it will not be enough to discredit the statement, without explaining how so many witnesses were misled, the great proportion of whom, like myself, went to the place thoroughly incredulous, and left it thoroughly satisfied that there could be neither delusion nor imposture. Respectfully and truly yours, W. B. O. Peabody. Springfield, February 14, 1834. This is a case of spontaneous somnambulism, but its features are throughout perfectly analogous to those of somnambulism induced by magnetism, although none of those who witnessed it regarded it in connection with the latter subject. Several other instances of clairvoyance during natural somnambulism are recorded, as also of the prediction of probable events and the occurrence of circumstances happening at a distance. The following instance is stated in a letter from Captain Gaudinet to Monsieur Ricard, and is published in his work. In 1831, my sister, aged 18, was attacked with an hysterical disease. In the course of the attack, and after nervous spasms, she fell into a state of natural somnambulism, and indicated, her eyes being bandaged and without a candle, the color of the clothes of each of the persons near her, and said whether she knew them or not. One evening, the attack having lasted very late in the night, and her doctor, considering that his remaining with her was unnecessary, had gone away, the patient said, "You think the doctor is gone to bed and is sleeping, but you are wrong. He is consulting his books respecting my case, and I shall not be better until the remedy which he fears to administer to me is applied." The fact having been verified was found to be perfectly correct. Bordeaux, 20th September, 1837. The phenomena most commonly presented by persons subject to magnetization are varied and numerous. Frequent winking of the eyelids, spontaneous paleness or flushing, a feeling of heat or cold in the head, epigastrium or extremities, partial or general pricking, muscular contractions, spasms, and accelerated or retarded circulation, palpitations. Some experience an indescribable sensation of calm and well-being, others a general feeling of indisposition, a state of somnolency for a longer or shorter period analogous to coma. When in magnetic somnambulism, the individuals are, to a greater or less extent, insensible to external stimuli, as noises of all kinds, pungent substances, as ammonia, applied to the nostrils, pinching, pricking, or other mechanical irritation of the skin, but at the same time are mostly able to hear when addressed by the magnetizer, or by persons placed in connection en rapport with them, answering questions and performing various actions ordered by him. These effects are not equally obtainable upon all, and several have been subjected for hours to the action of a powerful magnetizer without experiencing any or only slight effects. Certain individuals experience effects altogether different from those which are manifested upon others. Some, says Monsieur Ricard, are endowed with surprising sensibility, others are but little impressionable. One may, however, easily convince oneself that the same persons who in a state of perfect health experience nothing from the action of magnetism may be easily affected by it when they are attacked by disease. Some individuals who experience no effects from the action of one magnetizer would feel very marked sensations from the action of another. Climate, the condition of the atmosphere, the temperature of living or inert bodies which surround us, and the physical and moral dispositions of the magnetizer and of the subject likewise exert a very positive influence. The above mentioned are, however, merely some of the more common effects, and according to the magnetizers, are sometimes the precursors of much more wonderful phenomena, such as the transposition of the senses to other than their natural organs, clairvoyance or mental vision, in which, though the eyes be closed and bandaged, objects can be distinguished by the somnambulist when before him, or even if placed on the epigastrium, occiput, or other parts, the power of predicting probable events, of ascertaining the nature of diseases of individuals presented to them, of describing unknown persons at a distance, etc., etc. Of 100 persons subjected to magnetism in France, somnambulism was induced by Monsieur Ricard in 25. In the south of France, the proportion was from 60 to 70%. At Paris, of 100 persons who accidentally presented themselves without any special conditions as to health or other selection, the proportion of somnambulists was 20. 22 out of 25 somnambulists, according to the same author, will present extraordinary phenomena, and at least 10 out of this number may attain considerable lucidity. A curious circumstance is that it is not the persons who in their waking state possess the greatest amount of knowledge or mental qualifications who are brought to perfect somnambulic lucidity. Experience has proved, on the contrary, that it is generally the most ignorant and common individuals who most frequently arrive at this extreme development of the faculties, and who attain most quickly to perfection. And that was the end of that chapter. We are at page 94, so nearly 2/3 through this book. I guess probably 2 more episodes, and we'll be fully up to speed on mesmerism. It sounds simple enough. I mean, those instructions to perform it didn't sound too difficult, so maybe get some people together and try it out. Thanks for joining, and more to come.